Welcome to the Capital Forum's Antitrust Thought Leader Interview Series. I'm Teddy Downey, Executive Editor here at the Capital Forum, and I'm delighted to be here with Seth Bloom of Bloom Strategic Counsel. Seth is a dear friend of the firm, as well as I think I can call him an antitrust legend in D.C. He used to work on the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee before going out on his own, and I'm absolutely delighted to have him here today.
Well,
thank you so much for doing
Thank you so much, Teddy. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I just want to say that everything I expressed are my own views, not the views of any client.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And so I think, we are really interested in talking about what your view of the election. We've got an election coming up. We've had a very jam-packed Biden administration when it comes to antitrust enforcement so far. Mm-hmm. Would love to get your take on how you would see either a second Biden administration or a second Trump administration in terms of what we could expect to be similar or different from after the election.
So I guess I'll say this is one of the most consequential elections for antitrust policy, for antitrust enforcement that we've seen. And the reason I say that is because it's been such a strong, aggressive, pro-enforcement regime under FTC Chair Khan, under AAG Cantor, and in the Biden administration generally, with his competition counsel. With shortly after he became president, a few months later, he had his whole executive order on competition policy. I mean, really charted a new course for antitrust enforcement in the United States. And as I said, an aggressive antitrust enforcement policy we hadn't seen in this country since, in my career in antitrust, but I think one can say since Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, in 100 years. So almost revolutionary. I mean, they really tried to revive antitrust enforcement, brought a whole series of cases, whole series of rulemakings across the board, and very vigorous, aggressive antitrust enforcement. So what happens why is this election so consequential? Well, should President Biden not be reelected, if the Republicans take power, if Trump were to win, I think, we'd see a very different antitrust enforcement regime. It'll probably be a more return to traditional antitrust enforcement. Not to say that, it won't be Chair Khan heading the FTC, it won't be AAG Cantor. Not to say they'll just roll over and be a rubber stamp for all deals and they won't engage in enforcement. Obviously, the Trump administration brought the case against Google, the search case against Google. They brought the FTC under a prior chair, brought the case against Facebook, Meta. So it's not like they wouldn't do anything. But clearly, this kind of new course of antitrust, that would not continue in the same way. So I think this election is quite consequential. If Biden is reelected, I think we'll see a lot of the same. A continuation of this policy. The question will be who will be running the agencies. Will Lena Khan stay on? Her term expires in September. Will Jonathan Cantor stay on? Those are all questions which I don't know. But I would predict that they'll continue the aggressive, highly pro-enforcement policies if Biden were to be reelected.
And I have a bit of a hypothesis,
okay.
On if Biden wins re-election, that it could actually and get more comprehensive, because Biden's initial picks for his cabinet weren't all necessarily on board with the Chair Khan, the Cantor vision for antitrust enforcement. It's taken a lot of time for a lot of the staff at other agencies like Department of Transportation, Department of HHS, to even kind of reorient around the executive order to understand how to even do that, because that's not been part of how they do things. You get a new, Secretary Becerra has said he may leave, or, there's been reporting about him maybe leaving to go run for governor. How important are the appointments at the other agencies, HHS, Treasury, maybe Fed, when it comes to banking, healthcare? how important is it? And would you expect, just since there's the executive order, that they would be looking for people to be, when they make those picks, HUD to be on board with this competition agenda, or do you kind of expect it to be the way it was when he got on, which was, some people who are on board, some people who are sort of more traditional?
I think it's a good question. I think you identify an issue, and I think clearly the people that will be appointed, will be nominated, will know which way the winds are blowing in the administration, and will want to be very pro aggressive competition policy. I mean, we've already seen it, such as the Department of Transportation when they were initiated or were going to initiate a procedure to block the JetBlue Spirit deal, had that not been blocked by the court. And that was sort of a radical way of, in the transportation department, looking at an airline merger. But you're right. To the extent that a cabinet secretary or a cabinet department has not been as aggressive, I think in a second Biden term, we can expect that to be throughout the Biden administration. That'll be something that he'll want to see from his nominees, to be at this view, certainly.
One thing we have heard from some people who are theorizing about what might happen under a Trump administration would be that there would continue to be a crackdown on big tech.
Yeah.
How would would you expect that to continue, and how would you expect that to sort of differ from the Biden administration approach?
So, yes, I would expect it to continue. Now, as I said before, the Google case, the Google search case, was brought under the Trump administration. Bill Barr is the Attorney General, and the case against Facebook at the FTC. The Trump administration, or the people on sort of the right wing of the Republican Party, are very anti-big tech, and they talk about it all the time. And we've seen people like in Congress, people like Matt Gaetz in the House, and it used to be Ken Buck, but he's retired now, and people like in the House, but Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz have been taking a very anti-big tech belief. Now, they take that belief, I don't think because of their love of antitrust policy. It's because they believe the big tech companies discriminate against conservative viewpoints, suppress conservative viewpoints, which, of course, the big tech companies deny. But that's what they believe, and that's caused them to want to crack down on big tech in a whole number of ways, including antitrust. And there's even been some people saying they really like Lena Khan, some people on the right wing of the Republican Party. So, no, I would expect the antitrust scrutiny of big tech to continue. Now, I think it just wouldn't be across the board in every other sector of the economy that we see today. But sure, that's right. Because they're just so ideologically opposed to big tech right now.
And we've talked previously about your views on DOJ's case against Google on search.
Right.
We've got the ad tech case coming to trial later this year.
Right.
Would love to get your thoughts on that case. Right. And then after that, maybe we can talk about some of the other big tech cases.
Yeah. Well, on the Google search case, I've been very much an advocate or believer that the DOJ is on the right track, and it's what they're alleging is very similar to what brought down Microsoft in terms of the monopolization case of the DC Circuit. So I'm a big believer in the Google search case that DOJ brought and went to trial last fall. In the ad tech case, I think they've also got a strong case. I mean, you have a company that has a dominant share of the ad exchange and the buying side and the sell side of the ad tech market. So it would seem to raise competitive concerns. Now, what they're asking for there is pretty radical by antitrust standards today. Is a breakup. You can't control all three sides of this industry, and whether the court will go along with that, we'll see. But I think they've also got a strong case in the EdTech case, which is being heard in federal court in Virginia.
And that's famously in a rocket docket, which has been a case that's been brought and tried within basically a year, a little over a year.
Right.
Do you think that changes the calculus for business going forward in terms of thinking, hey, you know what, I can just prolong any antitrust case 6, 7, 8 years.
Right.
You're going from complaint to judgment, and then it'll go on appeal, I'm sure, one way or another. But you're talking about the whole thing being wrapped up in maybe 2-3 years potentially.
Right. Maybe in terms of trial level, maybe before that.
Yeah. How does that change how people think about antitrust.
It may change a little bit, but that applies to a case brought in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is very unique with that rocket docket. The Apple case, which was just brought a couple of weeks ago, was brought in district court in New Jersey. And I don't know if the district court in New Jersey particularly has a rocket docket, and most jurisdictions don't. We've seen in the Google search case, it's now been going on for over 3 years. The trial is going to take. I mean, they had the evidentiary phase of it in the fall, but we don't have closing arguments until May. That trial, so. And then if Google is found liable, there's a damages phase, which will probably take place next fall. That trial itself could take almost a year. So that's a long time for a trial. But I think the kind of schedule of that is more typical than the Eastern Virginia. So I don't know if that's really going to change the way businesses are going to think, unless we're going to see DOJ bring all its monopolization cases in the Eastern District of Virginia.
We're doing. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see strategically whether or not the third district makes sense.
Third Circuit.
Third Circuit.
Yeah,
Sorry,
right.
Third Circuit makes sense to bring that Apple case, but that's a good segue to talk about the
Sure.
the Apple case. It's a monopoly maintenance case. It definitely tries to talk about all these different types of conduct that protect Apple's ecosystem from competition, but would love to get your views on how it's a weak case, strong case. Maybe compare it to Google,
Sure.
which you obviously are on the record saying it's a strong case.
Right, exactly. Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm gonna say I'm underwhelmed by the Apple case. But just to show, I believe there's a place for monopoly cases like the Google case with a strong case. So I sort of have those bona fides. But on the Apple case, it really surprised me. Well, on a couple of reasons. One, we're talking about a monopoly maintenance case. You have to have a monopoly. So what do they say? 70% of the performance smartphone market. What is the performance smartphone market? I had not heard that term prior to the case being filed. Okay, they say if you want to put that outside, 65% of the smartphone market. Interesting thing, though, which cases have found 65% share can be a monopoly, but it's sort of at the low end. But interesting thing is that's based on the sales revenue, not based on the units sold. This is a controversial notion in antitrust, that's how you properly measure a market. And I'm not sure that they're going to prevail on that. And if you look at the units sold, it's about a 50%, maybe even a little less. Clearly not a monopoly. So that's problem one with the case. But I think the second problem, maybe even a little more significant, is the type of conduct they're alleging. It seems to me to be pretty minor, pretty small fish of which you're accusing Apple engaging in monopoly conduct. We talk about things like the text messaging, and it's a green rather than a blue bubble. That seems to me pretty trivial. Now they say the text messaging, it's not as functional. You can't get the full video, or you can't watch somebody with the dots reply. But it's not as if Apple say you cannot interconnect at all. That would be a different story. No, there's interconnection. There's other things. There's 5 forms of conduct, and none of them seem to me to be very strong. Cloud gaming. Okay, they're not allowing cloud gaming on the iPhone. So they want people to buy the hardware so that they have to load each game differently. To most iPhone consumers, and I know there's iPhone consumers who care about this, but maybe they're 14 or 16 years old. To the vast majority of iPhone consumers, is it really important to them that they don't have this cloud gaming functionality? I mean, do you do any cloud gaming on your iPhone? I mean,
No,
I've never done any.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so there's that. There's several other things. The interconnection of watches that aren't the iWatch. Well, it's not as if they can't connect. You just can't do text messaging on that watch. I mean, it just seems to me to be a very small scope of the conduct alleged. What they did leave out, and this is why I'm surprised, is most of the controversy around Apple for the last few years has been the App Store. And what their critics will say are the excessive taxes, 30%, and how to download apps you have to use the App Store. You can't use anything else. This was the Epic Games complaint, and then also that you have to use the payment system. You can't use an alternate payment system for apps. You have to use the payment system.
That was in there about the banks.
It was about the banks. I don't know that it wasn't one of the 5 specific types of conduct.
Yeah.
it really wasn't an essential part of this complaint.
They said you're basically you're levying a tax on banks by forcing them to
Well,
pay
that's
for
right,
Apple
but that's for
Pay.
transactions.
Yeah,
It's not with the App Store. That's because
I see. Yeah,
it's a little
yeah.
different. But they left out the whole app, which gave rise to legislative proposals introduced in the last Congress, the App Store bill by Senator Blumenthal, which got 20 out of 22 votes in the Judiciary Committee last Congress. I mean, I just was really surprised that they left. That to me would be the strongest antitrust complaint against Apple, and it's not there. So as I say, and to sum it up, I'm sort of underwhelmed by that complaint.
I'll push back on a couple of things. First, the market definition. They use Apple's own documents, which they're very clear about. It's a very short section.
Okay.
I find it, pretty compelling that if you're going to use if you're basically saying you're using their own documents, like we'll see what those end up being, but that tends to be pretty telling when they're talking about how they view the competition. So I'm not as, I don't think I didn't think of that as a weak thing. Also, the Apple's like figurehead PR people response effectively was, you should look at the global market for smartphones, which to me sounds like a very weak posture in defense. That's not really how the smartphones are bought. You don't buy a smartphone from China, it's not happening.
Okay.
And then the other thing that they said was DOJ should have to come up with their own market definition without using the documents, which also makes no sense to me. So I thought I'm not as skeptical of DOJ's arguments on the market definition. And then, but to your point on which of the types of conduct were included, I was actually surprised, and we've done some reporting on this, that the Taiwan Semiconductor arrangement with Apple, where they get access to the entire slate of the next gen chips, wasn't discussed. Just because if you're talking about how to protect your ecosystem, then that's ostensibly ostensibly Samsung is kind of the one that would be, next able to sort of make a smartphone that's competitive. If you can't get access to that next gen of chips, how could you realistically compete on the high end?
Okay.
I was surprised that wasn't in there.
Right.
Now, the last thing I would push back about, and then we'll move on, but actually I kind of want to get your response to this, is the green bubble.
Yeah.
When you talk to the average person, that's the thing they identify with most as something that has compelled them to buy an iPhone in the past. Well, I had this thing.
Right.
I was like ostracized.
Well,
I was socially excluded. Yes. This is actually something that comes up pretty repeatedly among people who try to go and not be in the Apple ecosystem. Okay. So from a real world standpoint, I guess it will be interesting to see at trial how viable arguments like that are, because from a real world standpoint, it does seem material. But from an antitrust standpoint, it may, classically, well, technically, we're going to get into this market. It doesn't seem as, maybe as compelling.
I think, you have, as I said, they do allow interconnection. If they didn't allow interconnection, that would be a different story. Right. So the question is, what the antitrust significance of that? Just to respond to a couple things. I mean, I can't quarrel with you on the documents, but I will say, the government's going to bear the burden of proof. We're going to have to see how the precedent lines up on what's the proper measure. Is it units sold, or is it sales volume? Obviously, it's higher if it's sales volume because the iPhones are more expensive. So that's going to come out of trial. Can I just, and that's going to be a hotly debated trial. Can I just make another point we haven't gotten to on this case, which is one good news, though, for DOJ and bad news for Apple, I think, is the judge. If the judge is a Biden appointee, and fairly recently as a Biden appointee, one would think that judge, as we saw in the Penguin Random House Simon & Schuster case, decided by Judge Pan, would be deferential to the Justice Department. If they don't have a DOJ background, and they don't have, rather, an antitrust background, are they going to go, they're going to be, it's a very complicated, difficult area, they're going to defer, likely, to the judgments of the Justice Department. And they're going to be sympathetic to the goals of the Biden administration. So I think any judge who's a relatively recently appointed Biden judge is a good judge for the Justice Department here.
Let's talk about the Senate for a little bit. We've got an election there coming up.
Yeah.
By all accounts, it's going to be super close.
Yes.
maybe the Republicans are slight favorites to, have a 1-seat majority, maybe. But when it comes to antitrust, you've got this weird dynamic where you've got J.D. Vance, Hawley, et cetera.
That's what I was saying before.
What you were saying before, sort of aggressively anti-big tech. You've got a new Republican leader that will need to be elected. What do you think the opportunity is for legislation next year, whether it is big tech related, antitrust more broadly, privacy, anything in the sort of competition world? Would love to get your take on how you see the sort of momentum in the Senate for stuff.
Well, let's start with antitrust legislation before we move to other topics of legislation. It's interesting that ACOA, Senator Klobuchar's antitrust bill against preferencing, has not yet to date. We're in April when we're recording this. Has not been moved. She introduced it. The last Congress, it got through the Senate Judiciary Committee 16-6. She hasn't tried to advance it. And as I said before, Senator Blumenthal's App Store bill, which got through 20-2 last year, hasn't even been introduced. So the legislation is basically stalled. And I think the reason the legislation is stalled is because the sense the House wouldn't move anything because of the change in leadership of the House Judiciary Committee with Jim Jordan. So I guess they haven't wanted to put the effort into doing it. Next year, even if the Republicans take over with a slim majority, which we don't know will happen, but it could.
Yep.
These are bipartisan bills. And I think, and it's very much likely to be a Democratic House, which will be very favorably inclined to these bills. So I think there'll be a major push again next year, next Congress, both for Klobuchar's ICOA bill and for the Blumenthal App Store bill. I would expect an active antitrust legislative agenda next year, even if it's a Republican, because bipartisan co-sponsor to Senator Klobuchar bill is Chuck Grassley, the lead co-sponsor, and the Blumenthal bill has plenty of Republican support. So I would say that. Those bills aren't going away. In terms of the other, there's going to be a lot of action on big tech. We've already, on privacy, we've already seen a proposal this week as I'm recording this interview, of a proposal for a new privacy legislation. Certainly children's privacy legislation seems like it's moving. I think if they can't enact the overall privacy bill, we'll still continue to see activity in that. And in general, as I said earlier, the suspicion of large big tech is bipartisan from many quarters. And so, I would expect to see an active legislative agenda. The Republican, and it's bipartisan, the Republican takeover of this, if there is a Republican takeover of the Senate, shouldn't be a roadblock for that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It seems like I need to be a little bit more prepared for congressional coverage next year.
Yes, you can congressional reports.
We did an election interview recently, and it seemed like the Democrats were slight favorites to win the House, especially if Biden wins the president. If he's a slight favorite to win re-election.
Okay, I'll make a prediction which you can replay in November. I think it's a very strong favorite that Democrats take the House. It could even happen before the election with all the Democratic, Republican resignations, but I think they are. I just think,
And why do you think that?
Well, because the Republican majority, which was very slender already, people heading into 2022 said they'd have a 20 or 30 seat majority. They had, I think, about a 4-seat majority. Is based on victories in districts that are carried by Biden in 2020. And especially if we see a strong Biden vote in the fall. But these districts, I think, are going to come back home to Democrats. So that's basically why I think the case. Plus the general tenor of the country with the abortion issue. We'll see what happens with the overall presidential election, but there's a lot of mobilization against Trump generally. So, I really expect, and that's a prediction that I'll make, that Democrats will pick up the House.
Okay, great. And in terms of, one of the things that we've seen a lot from this administration is working very closely with state AGs on antitrust. State AGs have become extremely active.
Absolutely.
In antitrust. You've seen a lot of plaintiffs' cases get past the motion to dismiss on antitrust claims, which has historically been a very high bar.
Yes, it is.
How do you see the judiciary, the state AGs, are we past this sort of moment where, consumer welfare, just like we don't see antitrust as a big thing? in the U.S. It's super hard to bring cases.
Right.
Have we gotten past that? Are we past this? Are we in a bit of a different era now?
Well,
Or
we certainly are in the current FTC and DOJ, in the government enforcement, and amongst the states too. The question is, how lasting is that going to be? But they've repudiated that, and they talk about effects on labor, on mergers being the new merger guidance being a key component, in a whole number of ways that we've gone past that. So the question is, well, and state AGs are increasingly important. We saw that in the Kroger-Albertsons challenge, where two states, Washington State and Colorado, filed their own cases before the FTC did, their own challenges to that merger, which I don't know that I've really seen that before. And I wonder why they did it ahead of the FTC challenge. It may be because they were worried that the FTC wasn't going to challenge, and so we're going to go ahead and do it ourselves. That was a long time after second request compliance that the FTC took to file their merger challenge. So we've seen that, but in a whole variety of ways. All these cases, these major cases, the ones against Google, the ones against Facebook, the ones against Apple just filed, have had plenty of states join the case. And yeah, I think the thinking in antitrust today has moved sort of beyond the consumer welfare standard and the obstacles. Now, you said that were put up to antitrust cases. You said the judiciary. That's a very interesting thing, because traditionally, in the last few decades, has been much more conservative, even than the existing enforcers before. And a lot of cases were lost. We've seen that in the Biden administration. Microsoft Activision is a good example of that. And so people say, well, the judiciary is conservative. Well, President Biden's been making a fair number of appointments to the judiciary. And like we see with the judges that were drawn in the Apple case and other cases. So I think the judiciary is changing, where it could be more receptive to these cases now, but that's at the trial court level. I mean, there's still conservatives there, but there's more, which you might call liberal or pro-antitrust enforcement judges. However, the big problem, I think, on the judiciary for antitrust enforcement is the Supreme Court and a 6-3 conservative majority, which already before has been hostile to antitrust enforcement cases brought by plaintiffs. So the Supreme Court can, if there's some cases that get appealed and get taken up, and they can sort of upset this whole apple cart. So that's the one thing that remains. And look at what happens with the Apple case. Should it, this is 5 years down the road, but should this case ever they get a verdict against Apple, should it ever go to the Supreme Court? I think this Supreme Court, there could be changes by then. This Supreme Court would be very likely to overturn a verdict against Apple. I just believe that. So, yeah.
Well, what do you think about the Supreme Court's conservatives actually being at the forefront of skepticism of big tech's Section 230 immunity?
Yeah, that's true.
Skepticism around their claims to also have First Amendment protection.
That's true.
And just generally being more open to utility-style regulation of big tech. I agree with you generally that the Supreme Court probably, if they had their pick, would say, shoot down any kind of aggressive antitrust enforcement to the extent they can curb the law. But on the other hand, they're looking for ways to deal with big tech, right? They seem concerned that big tech has too much power. They were looking for ways to curb Section 230.
Right.
They weren't. It seems like they weren't given any that were to their liking.
That's interesting.
Would love to get your take on how to think about.
Well, the question is the Supreme Court going to be like Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance, and it's because they're so hostile to big tech, be pro antitrust enforcement. Will this kind of thinking, devolve into antitrust? Now, I think I hear that, but the Supreme Court obviously is aware that it's creating precedent, and which can be applied to non-big tech cases, and they've shown a lot of hostility to Section 2 monopolization cases, the standards for pleading, Twombly. There's all Legion on resale price, but you can go to a whole. And I don't know that they're going to upset the apple cart of all that precedent because they feel this antitrust precedent, because they feel this discomfort with big tech for the reasons you described. So I think that's something people ought to think about, which it's the correct thing to think about. But I still would think, even if they were hostile to big tech, or some of those conservative Justice Clarence Thomas, still they would have a long way to go to accept the Apple complaint as an example. Um, we'll see. Time will tell, and that's a long way down the road before these cases get to the Supreme Court. But
Yeah.
That's my view.
Absolutely. All right, last question.
Yes.
I want to talk about big pharma.
Okay.
There has been, that's another area where the Trump administration actually wanted to take some action.
Absolutely.
The Biden administration has tried as hard as it can, from the White House at least. There hasn't been too much success, I would say, in actually bringing the prices down. You have some minor wins here and there, potentially. How do you see the next administration really tackling drug prices, whole of government approach, antitrust?
Yep.
Um,
Well, those are good questions. I mean, this is another area where if there's a change of administrations, I think the policy would stay the same, basically. The Trump administration was just as concerned about high drug prices and the FTC under Joe Simons. And so I think you would see a continuity. But they'll, and if Biden wins, obviously it's a continuity. I mean, right now they've had for several years, like the inquiry into PBMs at the FTC. And we haven't really seen any results of that, which is taking a little bit of time to surprise me. But I would expect that to be continued. Yes, and they will have a whole of government approach. They'll look, like getting back to antitrust, they'll look very carefully at mergers amongst pharma companies. And it'll be a tough environment. And they look at not just overlapping drug portfolios, but impacts on innovation and medical research. That's something they want to highlight. And this FTC, which really comes under jurisdiction of the FTC, but I'd expect that to continue into any new FTC. So it's going to be tough. But yes, if HHS can get involved, the whole of government approach, that's a particular Biden administration policy. But just the scrutiny on big pharma and the concern about increasing drug costs, increasing price of insulin, those kinds of things are very bipartisan, and I'd expect it to continue.
There is one other element of big pharma, which is kind of a broader issue, whole of government, where you've got trade, antitrust, and manufacturing policy kind of intertwined, and that's been kind of a recent trend as well, that an all-of-government approach involves all three of those kinds of policies working in concert to address something like big tech, which has influence in all of those three areas. Maybe less in manufacturing, but no, still a lot of say.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about semiconductors and things like that. And do you see that as a trend as well? I mean, I know that was what our conference in Brussels was about. We're sort of seeing some of that. Even Trump was pretty big on trade in terms of export controls and tariffs.
That's right.
So curious to get your thoughts on if that is kind of a concept that we should expect to sort of see, or is it,
Well, that's a little tricky because yes, Trump was very hardline on trade, nationalistic tariffs. But one thing the Republicans are quite critical of the current administration, or the current antitrust administration, is their cooperation with the Europeans and with the Digital Markets Act. And you're sending people over there they're critical of our companies, and why aren't you defending our companies? We saw FTC Chair Khan last summer at an oversight hearing at the Judiciary Committee, run into a lot of questions like that. So I think they're just, why are we cooperating with the Europeans when they're attacking our companies? I think there is that strain of thinking in the Republican Party. So I think that would change. But yeah, the hardline views on trade will continue. But that's this antitrust specific issue. I think that would be a change if there was another Trump administration.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. Well, Seth, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure as always.
I very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for doing it. Okay. All right.